Okay, everyone, it's 11 o'clock. We want to make a start. Thanks for coming to this session. Our first speaker today is Peter Nelson, who is Emeritus Professor of Music and Technology at the University of Edinburgh. He is a composer and theorist. His compositional output includes chamber, choral, and electronic music. He's been commissioned by many organisations. He was also editor of the journal Contemporary Music Review from 1994 to 2002. His research interests, in addition to time and signification, which we'll hear about today, include social aspects of rhythm and the work of Semiotics. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's very nice to be here in a universe far, far away. And I suppose, like everybody else, this presentation began its life at the beginning of the organisation of this event, and has taken a little bit of a change along the way. So the principal change, I have to say, is that for the last couple of years I've been working with a postdoc philosopher called Ian Campbell. And related to what I'm going to say this morning, we've just written a paper which will go into the last issue of the current volume of Angelaki, which will cover some of what I'm going to talk about today. However, this paper kind of moves on a little bit from that, and so any of the bad ideas or mistakes are mine alone and nothing to do with what as I was reading this over last evening, I thought some of it sounded a bit weird, and I think that may be because I'm trying to talk about quite familiar things from a slightly unfamiliar, to me anyway, standpoint. So, as the introduction to his 2018 book, Delayed Response, The Art of Waiting from the Ancient to the Instant World, media theorist Jason Farman tells the following story, and I quote: 5 years ago, as I sat in the audience at a conference in Boston, an anthropologist of Japanese popular culture described an emerging practice among teens in Japan. A teen would send a blank text message to his or her romantic partner, and the partner's job was to respond with a blank message with as little time elapsed as possible. These blank texts would be sent throughout the day and establish a rhythm for the relationship. As partners would respond quickly to each other, always being in contact without saying a word. The meaning of these messages was entirely dependent on how quickly someone responded, and that speed or delay, if someone's partner wasn't paying adequate attention, has significance for their relationship. The content of these messages was time. End quote. So this morning I want to start from the premise that, as in Foreman's story, time has meaning, and in this sense can act as a sign within a semiotic practice. To paraphrase the chapter, The Work of Time, in Pierre Bourdieu's Logic of Practice, it matters when things happen. This has implications for music and for music performance, and I want to try to tease out some of those implications here. I also want to suggest that in order for this sort of signifying to take place, temporal signs need a way to engage our phenomenological experience of the passage of time. Farman presents the time signs in his story as a succession of durations and events with a corresponding succession of affects. The process within this play of affects is referred to as a rhythm for the relationship. And here rhythm is presented as some sort of integrative function that pools durations, events, and affects into some sort of overarching sense of order and meaning. Rhythm is thus more than mere succession of events. It arises out of an experience of time signs, which it integrates in some way. I want to think more about this process of integration and to explore the ways in which meaningful layers of temporality permeate music as they do other aspects of life. Pulling rhythm and time together in this way is an insight from sociology, which recognizes at least two different strata for the understanding of the meaning of time. Again, I want to stress that I'm not thinking about time in a philosophical or purely phenomenological sense, but as something which is meaningful for us and where meaning is set up in specific ways. For Durkheim, one of the founders of contemporary sociology, time is both experiential and institutionalized. Durkheim linked institutionalized systems of time with societal transactions or patterns of associativity involving exchange, reciprocity, and collective sentiments. These institutionalized times are the times of working hours, holidays, and festivals, and synchronized clocks, which in contemporary westernized cultures form a foundation on which other temporalities can sit. So these also evoke temporal constructions like leisure time or waiting time, as in healthcare services, or break times, as in Amazon warehouses. They're not just practicalities, but evoke collective and personal affects. On the other hand, Erving Goffman, with his notion of the interaction order, is more concerned with the microanalysis of individual human interactions. And it's these sorts of interactions that Forman exemplifies in his story of the Japanese teenagers. These are the times of conversational exchange, meaningful silences, and gestural tics. The intimacy of these signs springs from our earliest dependency as neonates, unable to situate ourselves in the world without a lengthy period of social intersubjectivity. Bourdieu's insights somehow sit in the middle, showing how formalized human interactions such as gift-giving and revenge killing are defined and modulated by time signs. For certain actions, there are right times and wrong times, good times and bad times. And a sense of timing is a personal quality that identifies a style of action, not just what, but when. All of these insights point to the importance of time as a signifying element, and to the ways in which time signs get constructed and used in everyday life. So what are the implications of this semiotic practice in music? The implication of sociology in this discussion is a recognition that rhythm is social. Of course, music is social, but it can cloak that sociality in an analysis of the individual internal experience of music as a quasi-object. This has led to the identification of rhythm theoretical specifics, such as beat, accent, meter, etc., which, insofar as they neglect the social, must be theoretically suspect. Simha Aram, for example, in his brief survey of Western rhythmics, notes that even the legendary theorists Cooper and Meyer are forced to admit that, quote, one cannot at present state unequivocally what makes one tone seem accented and another not, end quote. This matters because accentuation is in fact the foundation of their whole theory of meter. The notion of accentuation seems to me to be a meaningful temporal construct that depends on socially mediated context for its observation. Categorized as an object, it disappears. Interestingly, in his book on orchestration, Rimsky-Korsakov points out that the best way to accentuate a note in music is to add 1, 2, or 3 grace notes in front of it. These act as a temporal cue, an upbeat, as it were, a varying dimension. And we'll come to a fuller discussion of that type of time sign shortly. It seems to me that the strata of time identified within sociology also appear in music, as the distinction between institutionalized and interactional temporal relationships. Institutionalized temporal relations include those identified in attributions of pulse and durational proportions, organized by normative cultural constructions of musical utterance. So in European terms, we're thinking about time signatures, metronome marks, and so on. If you think about Senegalese culture, in certain repertoires, you're thinking of the pattern of the dum-dum, and so on. The interactional temporal relations are usually dealt with under the heading of interpretation, the ways in which a particular performance situation articulates and evidences those institutionalized constructs as relations between actors in a musical performance network. If you're allergic to actors and networks, don't worry. You could say, again, to paraphrase Bourdieu's account of Vendetta, that the act is culturally preordained, but its action is subject to an individual temporal responsibility which carries semiotic weight, both as message and as style of delivery. The distinction between those strata is neatly evidenced in the track A Little Max from the album Money Jungle by the trio consisting of the amazing musicians Duke Ellington, Charles Mingus, and Max Roach. This music clearly has a beat and a tempo with appropriate cultural competence. One could even clap along to the beat. However, it is equally clear, having established the concept of beat, that none of these players is actually playing it. They sort of circle it with shifting temporal inflections that lend a style and a character to each participant. In this description, one could see a parallel with my initial story about Japanese teenagers, where in one description, Ellington, Mingus, and Roach are trading not only pitches, but also temporal gaps of response, time signs as a rhythm for the relationship. Now, this phenomenon has already been noted and analyzed by Charles Kyle in his theory of participatory discrepancies, where he famously states that, quote, music, to be personally involving and socially valuable, must be out of time and out of tune. End quote. Kyle also references Durkheim's account of institutionalized temporal relations, but Kyle is really more concerned with anthropological first-hand accounts of phenomena than with a theory of science. For him, quote, there is no essential groove, no abstract time, no metronome sense in the strict sense of metronome, no feeling qua feeling, just constant relativity, constant relating. I want to consider how the variable and the abstract might in fact interact in order to get a better sense of the semiotic power of this relating in time. The most carefully researched aspect of temporal relations is synchrony, the ability that humans have to entrain to a beat or pulse. Despite the tendency to investigate pulse as a solipsistic perception, the psychologist Colvin Trevarthen, in his foundational work on infant development, is clear about its intrinsically social nature. He writes, pulse is the regular succession of discrete behavioral events through time, vocal or gestural, the production and perception of these behaviors being the process through which two or more people may coordinate their communication, spend time together, and by which we may anticipate what might happen and when it might happen. The consequences of entrainment to a pulse are thus foundational, it seems to me, for other temporal relations. But I want to think for a moment about its semiotic import. In what way could synchrony function as a sign? In his book, The Dialectic of Duration, Gaston Bachelard considers the notion of synchrony in order to give a social and dialectical twist to Bergson's theory of time as pure duration. For Bachelard, time is not just something that happens. La durée, c'est une œuvre, he says. Duration is a work. If it's full, as Bergson claims it is, then it's because we fill it. And one of the things we fill it with is meaning in community with other beings and selves. Synchrony holds a special place in this effort. Bachelard writes, when one has effected this synchronization, that is to say, when one has put precisely together two superpositions of two different cycles, one sees that one has almost all the attributes of physical adhesive bonding. The time of thought marks thought profoundly. Perhaps one is not thinking the same thing, but one thinks something at the same time. And then about the notion of beat itself. The beat acts as a signal, not as a mere duration. It binds into coincidences, binds rhythms into instants that will stand out. End quote. So this proposes the notion of beat as a sort of time sign. It seems to me to figure as a sort of indexical sign that points to all the others involved in the synchrony, what Bachelard calls a sort of adhesive bonding. In my reading, the others in this case could include inter alia, actual people, other selves, material objects, conceptual constructs, cultural paradigms, and so on. Since Latour and others have taught us to reimagine the social, we have no need to be restricted. Two people, a piece of wood covered in goatskin, a place, a time of day, and a cultural practice can all point to each other by a time sign of synchrony. This could also be seen as existential in Eero Tarasti's sense, when he describes, quote, a reference to I, here, now moments, i.e. to a situation that prevails for a person at a given time and place. Or in my terms, a situation that prevails within a network at a given time and place, where the situatedness is very specifically temporal. If entrainment can be seen as a foundational temporal institution, what about the interactions that make up Goffman's interactive order? Those intimate, dialogical time signs that make discrepancy from a foundational synchrony both possible and meaningful. In his theorization of what he calls the intrinsic motive pulse, Colwyn Trevarthen sets about a detailed microanalysis of the temporal relations established between mothers and infants in the first months after birth. He characterizes these temporal relations as fundamentally musical. Thus, Trevarthen writes, musicality appears to be a human psychological process intimately linked with the unique intensity of the human need to make, learn, and transmit meaning in the experience of acting in common social experience. This focus on meaning makes the project properly concerned with signs, and the signs that Trevarthen investigates are those related to the inner motivations for expressive movement. A mother sings to her child, and the child vocalizes in response and gestures with its hands in movements that are temporally cued to the vocalizations of both child and mother in order to promote a feeling of sympathy within the pairing. The movement is temporally expressive through flow, as well as through the identification of instance. Thus, Trevarthen writes, the common core process is based on the specific hierarchy of brain-generated rhythms and the principle of variable tension or intensity that determines the dynamic effect of contours and impact of change in expression. And in addition, in the microanalysis of a particular pair of subjects, the infant is moving both hands, touching her clothes or the bottle, and moving them about in the air. Her gestures occasionally anticipate the mother's melodic and rhythmic change by a fraction of a second. This time sign seems to me to have the indexical import of pointing to a moment of coincidence, just like Rimsky-Korsakov's orchestration of accentuation through anticipated notes. Trevarthen speaks of the impulse to express the dynamic patterns of our minds in communicative form, but I would like to phrase this another way. I see the semiotic practice he describes as a dynamic pattern in a community rather than in an individual, where each participant, however internally motivated, has some understanding of a common dynamic pattern, which is not communicated, but which allows each participant an insight into, commitment to, and power over the trajectory of the communal interaction. The transactions within this interaction are conducted through time signs. It is this dynamic pattern and its negotiation through time signs that seems to me to approximate to what I would understand by rhythm. And to conclude, I want to think about that circumstance a little more closely. For some time now, rhythm has been a problem word. It is used often, but what it invokes is almost entirely unclear. In philosophical discussion, such as that underpinning the recent book, The Philosophy of Rhythm, edited by Peter Chain, Andy Hamilton, and Max Patterson, the foundation is the Greek notion of taxis chronon, the order of time. But at the start of this presentation, with the story of the Japanese teens and their text messages, order and succession do not seem to promise a complete account. In his tantalizing and incomplete late work, Rhythm Analysis, Henri Lefebvre proposes that, quote, everywhere where there is an interaction between a place, a time, and an expenditure of energy, there is rhythm. And this formulation seems to me to fit better with the social exchange that time signs require. In considering the Japanese text messages, I suggested that for me, the notion of rhythm is an integrating notion that somehow allows us to separate and coordinate the temporal strata within which time signs can be seen to operate. And in order to suggest a possible mechanism for this integration, my very last thought will turn briefly to an idea from Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce was concerned above all with logic, and in thinking through the elements of deductive reasoning, he develops the notion of the diagram. Quote, we form in the imagination some sort of diagrammatic, that is iconic, representation of the facts, as skeletonized as possible. This is always a visual image or mixed visual and muscular. End quote. The inclusion of the muscular is an inclusion of time. And as Valentino Cuccio and Vittorio Gallesi argue, this diagrammatic perspective is able to account for the representation of concepts within an embodied notion of cognition based on the neural mechanisms of sensory motor perception. It's interesting that it is also to Peirce's diagram that Gilles Deleuze turns in his account of the emergence of a picture from the visual signs on the canvas of the painter Francis Bacon. This is Deleuze. The diagram is thus the operative set of asignifying and non-representative lines and zones. The operation of the diagram, its function, says Bacon, is to be suggestive, or more rigorously, to use language similar to Wittgenstein's, it is to introduce possibilities of fact. End quote. So I'm suggesting here that as with visual perception, so with temporal perception. The child hears the sound of the mother as a random set of asignifying and non-representative temporal cues, which are suggestive. Thus, the child develops a relationship in time which is emergent rather than determined. In a similar way, we hear Duke Ellington, Charles Mingus, and Max Roach play, and the time signs of their appearance and disappearance in the music form a temporal diagram for us. As Peirce says, quote, "A diagram is clearly in every sense a sign of an ordered collection or plural, or more accurately, of the ordered plurality or multitude, or of an order in plurality, typical Peirce. And furthermore, the diagram not only represents the related correlates, but also, and much more definitely, represents the relations between them. This is what allows us, as it does the Japanese teenagers, to register temporal signs as relational and thus as affective within the negotiated space between the personal and the social. It is also in this analysis what allows us to make our own sense, not just of music texts, but of their individual performances as meaningful and social. In this brief discussion, I've tried to make a case for the existence of time signs in music as in other world interactions, and I've characterized those time signs as intrinsically social in relation. I've also suggested that rhythm, if we are to understand it as an integrator phenomenon and not simply as an order, might be thought of, as Peirce thought of the diagram, as an iconic sign that allows us a way to encounter with our own motivations shared time which has meaning. And thank you for sharing this time.
Peter, thank you so much for a stimulating and survey about some question time. We now have entered the collective and affective space known as question time, for which we have very little time. What I do propose, however, those of you who are staying for the second paper, we've got time afterwards. If you're not moving to other sessions afterwards, I think if we have the opportunity for further questions, either for individuals or panelists. But as Ben's setting up, we might have time for one question now, if there's any quick questions.
If I did say something, well, thank you very much. Your paper speech was very touching very fundamental issues of both semiotics and music. And I think your opinion about semiotics is similar to Raymond Monell, your colleague in Edinburgh, because Raymond always said that let's say music, the semiotic moment is a social one, social conventions and grammars. That's the right. The other view is by Julia Kristeva, it is core, is that undefinite mass or physio psychological issue which you have. Okay, but then how you just fit this social issue with that other view of time, which is of physiological origin. That's interests me very much. And then about music, you might think that some say that the first element in music is sound, like the German conductor Tiedemann says, the last element is Klang in their music, Klang. But some may say it's rhythm rather. So what do you think is the primary issue in music, rhythm or sound?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, by accident, I found an interesting interview on YouTube from celebrar-se, who speaks very clearly about the time of a performance, which he regards as a secret and magical thing. He says once the performance begins, its whole span lies before us in all its uncertainty. But he's very clear about the notion of the span that lies before us, that it's time. Well, of course, music's made up of all sorts of things. I mean, you know, sound is clearly critical, but I think there is no denying the temporality of it. And I think that so far as the physiological or philosophical notions of time are concerned, one of the weird things that thinking about this has made me wonder is whether or not time is really a highly personal experience. A highly personal experience. And that our notion of time as some big thing out there is maybe not so sensible. Sorry. But that's, I think
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. And one of the things that Peter did touch on was iconic signs, and Ben is going to come and get beyond that. So I think it follows on nicely. So Ben Curry, I'm sure you know, is a musicologist who specialises in musical meaning and musical analysis. His interests stretch from the 18th century to the present day and focuses on 20th century popular music, film music, and late 18th century music. He's also deeply invested in the philosophy of music, of which we're going to hear much today. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Ed. And thanks for coming along, everyone. So I'm going to talk about getting beyond the icon, but I'm going to talk actually more about the notion of quality. I'm not going to use a lot of Persian terminology. I'm tending to use kind of contemporary philosophical terminology when I can these days. But still, it's very much along those lines. So this is a quick overview. I'm going to talk about the way in which we might get beyond qualities or icons, that we don't really need them, that we can develop a system without that. I'm going to bring in this notion of speech acts as a way of doing that. I'm going to talk about the twofold speech act in Western art music. And I'm going to talk about how performances are usually expressives, which is a type of speech act. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about possible worlds, which we have a bit of sense of that. There's one way you deal with time in philosophy is to talk about possible worlds. And then the advantages of the model, and then talk about normativity, this key word in the title that I hope will run through. It's quite a complicated concept to get across, very central to contemporary philosophy. So first of all, qualities or properties or even predicates, arguably broader term. Can we get away from them? Well, think of the case of shadows. Somebody's moving across a plaza. Now,
can you please
the
speak to
question
the camera?
I have, what connects the shadow to the person? And those interested in semiotics have probably thought about this, but it's quite a nice example for pointing out that you can think about it as shared qualities, but you can also think about it as causation. Now, if it's shared qualities, I mean, how's that going to work? Okay, if we were able to stop time, then there would be this, we assume, some kind of shared shape between the person casting the shadow and the shadow. But are there really a kind of infinite number of shapes that occur when somebody walks across a plaza? Surely a better answer is there's a causal process involved. And I would go further and say that, in my view, all apparent connections through a sharing of qualities, in fact, is a causal connection. So that's quite, I still every day think, yeah, what about that? And it takes me a while to think, no, you can think of that in causal terms. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And what I'm saying is that I want to develop an account of musical performance and meaning that is, in principle, formulable without affording qualities, properties, or predicates a special explanatory role. Kind of inevitably, there'll be recognition of reference to types, but they're not going to be given a special explanatory role, and they are, in principle, we can do without them altogether, I would argue. Okay, so how we're going to go about this, one of the key things is this Searle's taxonomy of speech acts. According to Searle, so John Searle, who's working on the work of Austin, and Austin very much coming from Wittgenstein, claims that this is an exhaustive list of speech acts. Now, notice that qualities are not playing any special role in the explanation here. We have actions, so these speech acts. We have intentional states. I don't know if people come across intentional states, but hugely important again in contemporary philosophy. The intentional state is the ability of the mind to be about something other than itself. So you're kind of trying to really narrow down, what are we actually talking about? So much of our conception of meaning derives from intentional states, and they are states of the mind. Now, of course, the mind is already it's not quite the same thing as the brain. It's already we're getting into a kind of somewhat abstract area, but we can sort of allow this degree of abstraction. And then we also have this direction of fit, the connection between mind and world. So beliefs, or if I make an assertive, so if I say it's sunny outside, then the chances are, unless I'm lying, that I have a belief that it's sunny outside, and there's a mind to world fit because I'm trying to fit my mind to what's going on in the world. Okay, this is reversed when we have a directive. So if I say, please can you close the door, then I'm trying to get the world to fit to my mind. Okay, intentions comparable, but the subject's different. Now with expressives, it's a rather complicated situation, and a lot of our troubles in understanding musical meaning, I think, derive from this, because so often in Western art music we take the musical sounds to be expressives. These don't have that world to mind direction fit in the same way. They're more complicated because, in a sense, it's all in the mind. Yeah. So if I say I'm happy that it's sunny outside, we can't just look outside and agree, oh yes, you're right, it's happy, you're happy that it's sunny outside. So I'm mainly talking about my emotion, my happiness. But we presuppose that there is some sun outside, so there's got this presupposed connection with the world. And then finally, the declarative. This is quite a complicated one. There you have mind to world fit and world to mind fit. So if I say I hereby declare this meeting open, I'm both there's both a desire or intention to open the meeting, but I bring something about. Something actually happens such that there is a meeting. So things like so Searle takes this, in his sort of social ontology, he takes this in things like money, marriage, I would say music. This is playing an important role because we agree something is happening, it comes into existence to the extent that it does come into existence. Now, which of these is a score? Anyone I know we don't usually do interactive bits, but anybody, I'm interested in the people instinctively, what would you say? Is a score, marking paper is also a speech act, so you don't actually have to say something, you can do it by marking paper.
As an intention, I intend to make some music by writing this score.
Well, yeah, almost bang on. I would say same direction of fit, but I would say it's you're expressing a desire that somebody will. But I guess if you're going to perform it yourself, then it would be with the clear intention that you're going to perform this yourself. Then you're right. But the direction of fit is world to mind. So I think that's absolutely right. So generally, I'd say a desire because you're expecting in Western art music, you're expecting somebody else to perform it. But there's also the declarative. Okay, so there's also a sense of something comes into existence because somebody has said this is a musical work, just like if somebody declares a meeting open. And this has a logical structure. X counts as Y in circumstance C. So I would say a score counts as a performance in Western art music. Okay? And that, so we get around an awful lot of our problems if we just recognize that there's a sort of social ontology whereby we understand that if somebody produces a score, they're expressing a desire, but there's also this decorative, that it is then a musical work. There's also the twofold speech act, which you touched on already, because you've got performers and composers usually in Western art music. Most Western art music involves a twofold speech act. One act is the composers, the next is the performers. And the basic structure is very similar to many other twofold speech acts in natural language. So if you're writing a will, somebody writes a will, somebody else reads it out. Writing a note to be read out in school assembly, somebody writes the note, somebody else reads it out. Writing a play, getting closer to music now, somebody writes the play, other people perform it. Both composers and performers have a similarly important role. The most significant difference is that the performer is not necessarily committing to the normative oughts that the speech act set out. So what do I mean by those normative oughts? All speech acts, if I say it's sunny outside, I can't then say, or at least only without questioning whether I've, something's gone horribly wrong, if I say it's also not sunny outside. If I say it's raining and it's not raining, or if then that makes a little sense. Yeah, there's these kind of logical things which follow from speech acts. That doesn't mean you have to follow it. It doesn't mean you will follow it, but it means you ought to follow it. Yeah. If I say I intend to leave the room, but I'm not going to leave the room, it doesn't follow. It doesn't make much sense. So with performers and composers, you have these normative oughts, and you don't necessarily commit to what the composer did, but you usually would. So you might say, I don't endorse the sentiments in this piece, but and then play it. But that would be, kind of a weird thing to do. But generally, if I play a melancholic piece, I'd usually be endorsing the presupposition there are things, processes, or products in the world to feel melancholic about. And if I play a patriotic piece of music, I would usually be endorsing the presupposition there are things in the world to feel patriotic about. Those presuppositions again. Okay. Note, I'm not claiming that there is a thing called a musical work that dictates whether a performance is adequate. Yeah, there's clearly plenty of variety in how people might perform the second speech act, giving the first speech act as a logical constant. Somebody could read out a will such that nobody understood what they're saying because they said it too quiet. So there's this kind of social expectation, but it leaves enormous amount of variety, and we have a very similar situation in music. Performances are mostly expressives in WAM, I'm saying. So in principle, those sounds we term musical could be used to perform any sort of speech act. So, I mean, can you think of a directive in music, not Western art music, but in music? Yeah, that's a directive. Now, if that's played in a concert hall, nobody's going to, get up and and go and have their breakfast because it wouldn't work as a directive. In fact, it would probably be taken as an expressive. It would probably be thought there's some kind of emotional import to the intention to perform that sound. So in Western art music, as in many traditions, speech acts usually function as expressives. Importantly, this means the direction of fit between mind and world is complicated because expressives have no conditions of satisfaction for the mind to world relation. They only presuppose conditions of satisfaction. So the conditions of satisfaction for me saying it's raining are that it's actually raining. So it's only that presupposition that we get with expressives. Okay. So that's one complicated aspect. The other is possible worlds. So the point of much musical meaning concerns not the actual world, but a possible world has been a major source of confusion, I think. So possible worlds are an integral part of our reasoning, of our way of getting around in the world. So consider deciding whether you're going to get up now or in 10 minutes' time. You posit a possible world where you get up in 10 minutes time, when you don't, and or you think, what have I done that today? Something in the past. And also in the present moment, I think we think about ourselves in relation to these possible worlds, where what I might become and how to make sense of our past in doing that. So the positing of possible worlds can involve elaborate fantasy, but it can just involve making sense of how we're understanding our past, present, and future selves as agents in the world. So I think an awful lot of musical listening, those very personal, intense feelings, come from relating to the music in terms of these possible worlds. We get confused in music as to whether the distance from reality derives from the positing of possible worlds, or because, as an expressive act, a performance lacks conditions of satisfaction. So there's sort of two ways in which music has a complicated relationship with reality, both because it tends to be taken as the possible worlds and because it tends to be taken as an expressive. Okay, let's have a little music example. How are we going to understand the process of meaning? So I've talked a bit about the relationship of score to performance, the relationship of composer format with the twofold speech act. What about how meaning happens? Well, according to Searle, the nub of meaning is an intentional state which has this twofold structure. Now this is not in a opera house. The example I want you to think about first is the whistling of that tune you just heard by an accomplice to a burglar. Okay, so a burglar is engaged in burglary, and they want somebody else to whistle this tune to tell them that a stranger is approaching. Okay, so this is actually an assertive. It's quite straightforward. So we whistle so this is all in the head of the accomplice. They have the intention to whistle the tune, whistle the Obama, and the conditions of satisfaction is that they actually sound that tune is actually whistled. They also have a belief that a stranger approaches, if a stranger does approach, and the conditions of satisfaction there are that the stranger approaches. And the key thing is that the conditions of satisfaction for this are imposed here. But it's in such an important way that it's just, as well as the mind can be about something other than itself, it can switch the conditions of satisfaction this way. So what Searle's key point is that the conditions of satisfaction of the whistle tune become the conditions of satisfaction of the stranger, or are the conditions of satisfaction. It's performed with the intention that the conditions of satisfaction are one and the same. So we don't have this sort of processing, decoding, encoding, decoding process. They're one and the same. This, by the way, is a lie. So you can, and this is why you need in order to explain this, that would be a lie if you don't actually have the belief. And this, if this is not met, you do have the belief that the conditions of satisfaction aren't met, then it's a mistake. So that's partly why we need this twofold intentional state. Now, when we look at the case in the opera house, we again have this complex intentional state, but remember that there's a presupposed intentional state for what I'm saying is one way to approach the meaning here, that joy, the emotion of joy, is imposed on the conditions of satisfaction of the performance of the drama. This presupposes a belief that the thing that there is joy about, the party and the relationship that are taking place on stage, this presupposes it, but you can't check it in the same way, because the joy is in the minds of people, but it's in the minds of people in a possible world. Okay, so these are events in a possible world. No composer needs to feel joy. No performer needs to feel joy. there just needs to be this process whereby events in a possible world are imposed on the intention to perform. Okay. So what are the advantages of this model? Well, firstly, the immediacy of musical meaning is explained. There's no black box of musical meaning needed where things get encoded and decoded. It derives from intentionality, the ability of the mind to be about things other than itself, and the related ability to transfer the aboutness of intentional states. So there's no need to remember past emotional experience, states, associations, none of that. You just hear the music and you take it to mean joy. You take it as joy in a sense. The model can deal with very personal experience because people report and listening to Western art music as possible worlds are so important in our day-to-day sense making. There's no question begging, so we don't answer the question of why music means joy by pointing to parts of the music that are meant to mean joy or other parts of the world that are meant to mean joy. We don't point to the leaping six and say, well, they mean joy. Well, why do they mean joy? Okay, well, because they share qualities with somebody leaping up with joy. Well, why somebody leaping up with why is that joy? So we keep getting this sort of question begging if we with other models. Also, we do not encounter the problem of claiming that shared qualities explain meaning when all entities have an infinite number of shared qualities. Now, this has been recognized. Andrew Candy's book on philosophy of music that came out recently notes this, that can it be to do with these shared what they call the contour theory, shared shape? Can that be right? Because there's an infinite number of things. And the answer often is to say, well, but there's also these conventions involved. But as I say, I think they're equally problematic. And also, R.O. Young, in his book on philosophy, points to the problem of shared qualities, that there's an infinite number of shared qualities between any two things. And yet, it doesn't really address it. And I think this model does address that. So, normativity, just going to run over a little bit, sorry, but normativity is meant to be a thread running through here. With so much of this, we weren't talking about what is the case. Somebody might listen to Lidiamo and not take it to mean joy at all, of course. But the claim is that they ought to. Yeah, that's how meaning generally works. You might say it's far more complicated, and make a case that there's far more. Maybe it somehow suggests the tragedy of what's going to come later, and is not straightforwardly about joy. And you can have those arguments, but the key point is that we're talking about what one ought to do, not what one will do. So normativity does not concern what will be the case, but what ought to be the case. And these oughts form a network of behavioral tendencies that follow an internal logic. To explain why that logic works the way it does, we can only appeal to causation. That, where I was saying, we keep coming up to another, well, why that? Well, why that? Well, we keep, when we get this question begging, it's this, the problem with normativity, if normativity is absolute in a way, it's logic, it's either raining or it's not raining. Now, the world is, much, much more complicated than that. But if I say it's raining, I can't say it's not raining. But if we're looking for a kind of normative answer, we quickly run out of road because we run out of justifications. If you're looking for a kind of logical claim, so that's why I say you actually need to appeal to causation. In the sciences, they don't appeal to logic as the reason the way the world observed is. In any straightforward sense, there's very much a recognition that there are processes that we can predict. And it's the prediction which makes it right, not that you can say for sure that it makes no sense to say it's both raining and not raining. So does not derive from a set of musical meaning does not derive from a set of qualities that guarantee that notion of the normative. If something's normative, it guarantees it. Guarantees certain essential states. nor does musical meaning derive from intentional states that results from rules operating in the background, that Wittgensteinian claim. You know, we shouldn't think in those terms. Just as there's no black box in the mind, there's no black box guiding social interaction. So musical meaning, like meaning in language, results from a systematic reinforcing and extinguishing of behaviors, and both normative and causal explanation of these processes are inescapably social. And then I want to finish, so I know it's very difficult, and I struggled with this myself, but I think Wittgenstein's, where so much of this has come from, I said Wittgenstein, Austin, Searle, he gives us a way of thinking about this when he says, how am I to follow a rule? So he's talking about, we might say convention, and we sometimes say, well, qualities and rules together allow us this, but we get exactly the same problem, question begging, with rules. So if this is not a question about causes, we're effectively asking a normative question, then it's about justification. Yeah, if you say you ought to do something, you're talking about, well, there are justifications for that. So he's talking about the normative here. Then is it about then it is about the justification for acting in this way in complying with the rule. Once I've exhausted the justifications, that point I made about normativity running out of road, I've reached bedrock and my spade is turned. Then I am inclined to say, this is simply what I do. And I think to a large extent, this is, we have to change our question about musical meaning. If we want an answer that's, that isn't going to keep needing to be displaced, we need a question, we need to address that question in terms of causal processes. And we can do that, I think, by appealing to socio-biological processes that can be observed and which ultimately are not explained in normative terms. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry.
Another second stimulating paper in this session. We've got time for one individual question for Ben, and then I do propose, so if you can stay, we bring Ben and Peter up to the front and interrogate them closely on their ability. So do you have any questions for Ben right now? Intentional, assertive, or declarative? Martin.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you to perhaps challenge you. Have you been able to get rid of all the iconic elements eventually? Because it's a very bold proposal. I mean, how far can you push it?
Well, yeah. So I was very interested in Peirce, we mentioned earlier, and then I was kind of looking at neo-pragmatic philosophers, and then going to Sellers, which got me into normativity, and then that led to this interest in Searle, and then Sellers draws heavily on Wittgenstein as well. So that's kind of the root to it. But so Sellers, yeah, how far can you push it? I think I said this to James yesterday. So set very far in that. So what Sellers claims is that you can't reduce the normative logically or using the normative, but you can reduce the causal. So there is this sort of causal reducibility, and that, in a sense, is what happens in science. So if you talk about, so Sellers talks about swarms of microphysical particles as the ultimate reality of the world. Now, but then he sort of works up to that. There was a reference to reinforcing and extinguishing behaviors. If you think about reinforcing and extinguishing behaviors, I don't think you need to think about qualities. You can think of how we understand the world, or our best understanding works in terms of processes. And those processes don't need to share qualities. They may be connected, yeah. So trees are connected causally. He said, but yeah, they also look the same. But it's like, yeah, but that's kind of a shorthand for for the causal process, if you like. So this is one analogy I was thinking about, if I've just got time. The somebody says to you, right, a farmer says to you, right, I want you to pick up all the red berries that have fallen from this tree. So you go around, you pick up all the red berries. You think, well, you know they're the right berries because they're all red. So it's kind of straightforward. But actually, all those berries are causally connected. And if a scientist said to you, look, I want you to only pick up the red berries from that tree and not the one from there, and they might have blown across, well, then you're going to have, then actually the qualities of redness doesn't tell you anything. And there's a sense in which, yes, we've used this, the idea is that, there's a shorthand for picking up the berries, just pick up all the red ones. But the reality of the world is that, some of those berries are blown across from another tree and they're not actually causally connected. But so we have these sort of shorthands, but I think we can. And if you look at Sellers, he spends huge amounts of time working on this. He talks about a language, jumblies, where you don't actually need any predicates. So you end up kind of. So he talks about. You say John dances a tango. Well, you could reduce that to John tangos. But you could also reduce it to John drawn in a font such that you know that he's tangoing. So all there is actually is John, if you like, behaving in a particular way. So you can get this kind of thinking going where actually the tango doesn't need to exist to understand that behavior. You don't have to posit these qualities. So the answer is, I think you can, but it is hard work, and I do sometimes wonder whether I'll just go mad because everyone else. You do that. I'm going to talk about qualities, and the philosophical world is about split nominalism. I'm talking nominalism, Platonism, and something else. It's about a third each. So about a third of the philosophical community would endorse this to some extent. About a third would be absolutely set against it. Most of them working in the philosophy of music. Well, in fact, all of them working in philosophy. All of those working in philosophy of music are generally Platonists. And then the other third would probably give some kind of more careful account of drawing on both. But it's not a completely bizarre position to take. It's a big section. Sellers, Quine, the big names of the latter part of the 20th century.
I know it's a mindset, so thank you for inviting me to explore it.
Yeah, thanks so much. Next question.
Thank you. Okay, I appreciate some of you might need to leave now, but those of you who can stay, and either wish to question Peter or Ben, or if Ben is going mad, stage an intervention. So, do that now. Do you want to join at front, or do you want to, or are you actually, sorry, people want to stay. It looks like you've got a captive audience. Sorry, 1 minute, sir.
Very much for your very interesting presentation. I'm wondering if it is possible to exclude completely the theory of text from your considerations. When we are speaking about the score, where is the place for the text there? Because the speech act is discourse. You agree with that? It's the utterance. So the part of the discourse, as Ben very said. Yeah. So, for these two recursive theories, there is a fundamental distinction between the discourse and the text. I suppose you studied the text à l'action, from the text to action. So, there is a fundamental difference between the discourse and which is the speech act. In fact, the various possible speech acts and the discourse structured in the text, according to Ricoeur. So, for Ricoeur, for example, the musical discourse, the musical speech act, where it is in the mind of the composer, form when he explained his future composition, which is not yet becoming the text. The structured discourse becomes the text, which is the score. And then we have the action, is the performance, the discourse, and another transformation of the text to discourse. And that not yet with dissociate showed that the distinction from between the language, musical language, which is the score, and the performance in the place of la parole. So my question is there a place for the text in your consideration?
No. I would say.
I think it should be.
Yeah, sure. Well, we've got, I mean, there's an obvious sort of kind of like this in that I've got very interested now in the analytical tradition philosophy. You're drawing heavy on the continental tradition, and sadly they don't talk to each other an awful lot. So, I mean, I think the text, I wouldn't want to dismiss it. I think it's a useful way of getting at. So think of this distinction between speaking in ontology, speaking in things which fundamentally exist, and speaking in English, for example. We can talk about the text. You know, we can talk about money, right? We can talk about marriage. We can talk about all sorts of things which are essentially kind of patterns of human behavior. Yeah, so we have all sorts of patterns of human behavior, and we treat certain objects, marks on paper, as if one is a copy of another, and as if they all sort of result. They have this. They somehow reside somewhere platonistically as the text. But the best thing about the continental tradition is it points to the way in which the text is always elusive. It can never be pinned down. It is constantly in play. Well, I'd say the reason it's constantly in play is because these are just placeholders for patterns of human behavior. So ultimately, in ontology, strictly speaking, ontologically, there isn't a text. But I think the continental tradition, at its best, gets at this by showing this constant deference, constant difference, this constant way in which we're not able to pin down what that text is. Yeah. So in that sense, I'm saying not, I'm keeping the gate open to a possibility that it's useful to use the Wittgensteinian notion. It's useful to think about the text, and the continental tradition, building on Derrida, Ricoeur and others. The idea that the text is this constantly deferred and elusive process is useful. But I would say more useful is to look at what's going on in the world. So Wittgenstein's don't think but look, actually see what's happening. I haven't seen a text yet.
Yes, you have.
Where was that?
You're quoting all the time. You're quoting Derrida, quoting all context.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think to be charitable, it's a similar way of getting to the same thing. But I mean, the way in which music studies picked up Derrida and ran with it as a kind of, right, well, we've got this text and now we've got this textuality, completely misses the point, in my view, that the key point is that it's constantly deferred. But I also, I mean, you may know that Derrida and Searle had a massive falling out. It was so there's a kind of history of antagonism between these schools of thought. So.
It is constantly deferred and disseminated and deconstructed, and it is able to leave a semiotic trace. But
it doesn't live, does it? That's for sure. Yeah, sorry.
You're very rich. I appreciate that. It is very really interesting to discuss with you. But it cannot be deferred without existing previously, you know. So it must, it exists. How can we work with the text, with the scores in the intertextual, transtextual relation?
We
have the text.
We have marriage, we have money, we have all these things which don't really exist. But
That's true,
they work
but
as
the
placeholders.
marriage and the money doesn't function really very much with music.
No, sure, but they're comparable
and
social.
The score is pertinent to think considering musical questions. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, we could. This is another analogy I like. Imagine I'm a lot taller. Imagine I'm as tall as Ed, or even taller. And
Spent a lot of time
and
over the years.
one part of my house, there's quite a low. There's quite a low entry. So every time I go under it, I duck, and I do it in a particular way. I sort of do it like this. And my children start saying, "Oh, it's the dad duck again. Dad's ducking in a particular way." Now, so I've got this. I get this habit going, this behaviour, and we talk about it as the dad duck. But the dad duck doesn't exist. I just go into that room sometimes in a particular way. But I didn't bring it. There was no text. I didn't bring a text into existence any more than people do when they mark paper asking other people to behave.
No, because your ontological status is not textual.
Well, yeah, what I'm saying is that it has the same kind of. If you understand that it's a regularity in behaviour, ultimately it's just a regularity in behaviour. Then you don't need to posit some special text. It's just more behaviour.
I'm going to impose my chair's obligation here. I think this will probably continue the duration of the conference. So, Robert, you also had a question.
When I was working on gesture, I'm not a scientist, but I discovered that this man who mistook his wife for a hat, it suggested that there were two modular aspects of the brain. One was the imagistic simultaneous, being able to recognize all the distinguishing features of the face. And the other was what I call the more temporal gestalt, which is the man who lost this immediate imagistic ability could still recognize his students through their walking signatures. Now, the first suggests properties and qualities. The second suggests temporality. It seemed to me that gesture put the two of them together in a way that was very profound and very powerful. I wonder, your causality seems to be something that would beg questions as well, and also suggest the possibility of becoming a linear Markov chain of probabilities and so forth, that there would be some danger in begging the question with causality.
I think
there's some way of balancing these two so that we neither give up iconicity nor indexicality, but as, for example, in Peirce's example of Robinson Crusoe saying, "I'm not alone," he discovers the print, the footprint. It looks like a foot. It was produced by a foot, so iconic, indexical. And since the tide hasn't come in yet, we can assume that whoever made that print has existed for a day, can't get off the island unless they die. It's fallible, of course. Then he immediately says, "I'm not alone," which is the argument. So that all of these are motivations that go into the complexity of signification. But no one of them explains things. So I wouldn't say, oh, it's just an icon. But I would say the iconic, the lexical, and the symbolic motivations come together to create the meaning. How would you respond to that?
Well, as you know, I feel, for a long time that was kind of my thing, was that you need, and you have the icon, the index, the symbol, the whole thing. I always felt uncomfortable with it. It always seemed, I mean, best book on Peirce, I think, secondary source is Hookway, and he says the claim that the entire universe is reducible to these kind of three fundamental categories. It just seems, well, he calls it mind-boggling. I might maybe say it's kind of weird and borderline implausible. It seems to me much more likely that the world is and the universe involves a process, and that threefold category is more a case of how we get around in the world, how we make sense of things. That may well, your first point about aspects of the brain, that may well be because we sort of compartmentalize things in the brain. The brain works a particular way to get us around in the world, but it's a way of getting us around in the world nevertheless. It doesn't correspond to a kind of necessary division in the fabric of the universe, as Peirce seemed to genuinely think. But it's not very widely, it's not been very widely taken up. That, I mean, I know we as semioticians, we like it, right? But what has been taken up from Peirce is his work on probability. So that, the idea that the way we make sense of truth and reality by this sort of seeing ahead to the ultimate, I can't think of his term now, at long run, what will in the long run be the case? I buy that, and I think, and that's, I mean, Sellers draws on that as well in the scientific method. We make sense of the world because we know, and we make progress in our understanding of the world because we predict things correctly. But I don't think we need qualities. Peirce thought of these kind of things like hypothesizing as part of those qualities, but Peirce himself changes around the firstness and the thirdness, and it is actually quite a confused picture sometimes. Peirce, I know he has all these nuggets, but the secondary literature too says, well, actually, what's the difference between qualities and the symbolic dimension? It's actually quite difficult. So the thing I think he got right though is he says, it comes down to the second, the indexical is, and that's kind of my route to this, is what we can actually really be sure is the case. So, maybe I haven't gone away from Peirce.
Well, I'm not wedded to just those three categories, but certainly that I am wedded to the notion that there's a complexity involved, and that it's perhaps not wise to give up the qualitative just to go to the temporal. The temporal we've seen, and your wonderful paper has meaning, and it has meaning in various ways. But the temporal can be qualitative. Causal things can be qualitative. Duck in my head thing has a qualitative character to its movement. And so it is brought about through habit, right? And I would say that it does exist because it's an emergent concept.
Yeah, okay. Generally speaking, a concept as abstract objects
Or emergent categories that we can recognize, and it becomes a concept where you can deal with language, obviously, but it's certainly a category that the children are recognizing, and then they give a conceptual name to it. So that whole pattern is there. But if we talk about causality, give us an example of how causality will explain a complex phenomenon like a work of music. Don't you need levels of causality?
Well, yeah, you're already talking about a normative entity in music, so you're trying to see so you can reduce the form of it. You can sound. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, try and keep the answer short. So we've got more questions going. And so if you can explain music and causality in sentence.
All I would say is that causality is a somewhat question-begging notion for us as well.
Well, perhaps I don't think scientists, when they talk about causality, begging questions, they get things right because they allow them to predict things.
But I don't think scientists can get at the aesthetic dimension.
Well, that's I mean, it's part of this aesthetics kind of goes out. But what I would say with that question about music and causation, music is and particularly musical work makes it particularly clear, is a normative concept. So to try and then say how does it work causally, you have to start talking about it as an acoustic phenomenon rather than as music. See what I mean? So you could reduce it, but you have to start talking about it.
I'm going to have to stop that particular conversation there. That's more than one sentence. That's very naughty. Sorry. We've got a question, Peter.
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much. It's deep going, beautifully performed paper. Thank you. I would like to thank you also for underlining the human network quality of rhythm, away from all these tendencies to abstraction, and it's really refreshing to hear you talking like that about rhythm. And then there's a question for you that doesn't have nothing to do with your paper, or maybe it does, and it is about the question of regular poems. Because I've been wondering for many years, maybe you can illuminate me here. In nature and in most musical genres, you have what we call regular pulse, like a heartbeat or a pace. I'm not regular, really. They're irregular. And we call it regular just for the sake of simplicity. Okay. And however, if you play jazz, then you're expected to be able, somebody's got to keep this pulse really fixed, not quite like a metronome, because then it would have no swing, but it's this mysterious thing that it's got to be constant and firm. You know what I mean? You play jazz yourself? You do.
Okay. So first of all, I think the notion of regular is contextual. There's a beautiful story in, I think, Kurzak's book on dance, where he talks about going to a nightclub in Cairo with some Egyptian musicians. And in the nightclub, they're playing, band music based on a normative American pulse. And one of the Egyptians remarks to Sachs that he can't really bear the music because there's always a bit missing. So he's looking for a regular pulse. It's just his regular pulse is not a pulse but the same number of milliseconds between each beat. Yes, some of them in our parlance are longer than ours, but that's still regular for him. So what is regular?
Yeah.
Regular is a cultural construct, as is normativity. It's something which we learn within a tradition. So then, from that perspective, it seems to me, in the jazz situation, that within the cultural perspective, all of these things are negotiated. I suppose one of the things about the last discussion is that while I'm clearly interested in meaning, I don't think it exists.
You two are denying everything.
In the sense that what we're doing is productive, fundamentally productive. And I suppose, just to complete the distance, that's what life is. It's productive. If we're not producing, then we can die. So the notion about social negotiation is that it's fundamentally productive within a context. That would be my position. That it's productive, and that it's productive of social relations through all of these things that we use to form social relations: music, speech, dance, gift giving, murdering one another, all the rest of it. That, to be honest, don't see a whole lot of difference between some of those things, although clearly there are huge differences. But yeah, so
I have also a question to Peter, and also related to musical pulse, because you said that musical pulse can be understood as an index. Yeah? So I'm wondering whether this sign is conscious or not conscious, because we have one tradition related to Charles Peirce, that semiotics is strictly related to inference, to conscious operations, but we have, on the other hand, also a tradition of the use of semiotics in etology, zoosemiotics, let's say, and in that case, this is not necessarily related to consciousness. So is musical pulse an example of a conscious sign that people infer consciously that this is a sign of, let's say, being a part of a group, or this is a kind of, let's say, zoosemiotical sign in which people just unconsciously signal that we are a part of a group?
I suppose my instant response to that is that it's not decidable. I think that there are many instances, and indeed in Bachelar's discussion, he talks about, you know, this adhesive union, and that's clearly, what can I say, a moment where people understand implicitly that they are part of a collective. And I would say that collective could be just a person and a piano. Yes, but because the sound comes when you imagine it's coming, you feel bonded to that thing. And it's not an explicit sense of bonding. And it's very clear that if you don't hit the key properly and the sound doesn't come when you intend, then you know there's a moment of dislocation, that adhesion. And then I think it's clear from listening to you know, choirs in Johannesburg that adhesive bonding can accumulate large numbers of people who feel as one and who present as one. But at the same time, if you think about it, it clearly could be a sign in the conscious sense. So that's why I say I don't think it's decidable.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop there. Thank you. Thank you. Some questions.